Good afternoon. Welcome to today's meeting of the House Finance Committee. We'll have votes on about 3 bills and discussion of 2 more. But let me start by having our senior committee legislative assistant, Lori Smith, call the roll.
Chairman Samuelson,
Here.
Rep. Abney,
Vote by designation. Here by designation.
Sapita Freitas, Fleming,
Present online and will be voting by designation.
Gallagher, Gungauer, Harris,
Vote by designation.
Inglis,
Vote by designation.
Krajewski,
Vote by designation.
Rab,
Vote by designation.
Scott,
Vote by designation.
Venkat,
Vote by designation.
Waxman, Webster. Chairman Griner,
Here.
DeVanzo, Fritz, Gatos, Jones, Kephart, Kutz,
Vote by designation.
Mako,
Vote by designation.
Rossi, Rinkavich,
Vote by designation.
Stamba, Stender.
Thank you. All 26 members accounted for, and we're joined by some of the sponsors of the bills. I see Representative Prokopiak, Representative Siegel, Representative Freeman, and of course we have Representative Gogenauer as a member of the committee. I'd like to start with a vote. We had a public hearing, a committee discussion yesterday on 3 bills, including House Bill 1503 by Representative Prokopiak. I move that we bring up House Bill 1503, and I call on our committee senior research analyst Shannon Snell for a description of the bill.
House Bill 1503 would exclude the producing of internet access as defined in the Federal Internet Tax Freedom Act from the sales and use tax. And this change is needed because at the time the current sales tax exclusion on the production of mobile telecommunication services was signed into law, the internet was not widely used at home, and consumers mostly use their cell phones for calls and maybe text messaging. The law didn't anticipate the use of cellular data to access the internet, so this bill would just bring parity between mobile telecommunication services and internet access for the sales and use tax exclusion.
Thank you, and I appreciate the committee discussion yesterday. Does any committee member have discussion on House Bill 1503? Chair Griner.
Yeah, I thought it was a good discussion yesterday. I do think the way technology is changing, I think this makes sense, and I'm going to encourage my colleagues to vote affirmatively for this bill.
Thank you. Likewise, I appreciate. Do we have other committee discussion? Representative DeVanzo.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the good gentleman here from Buck, something that we worked together on. As the state's going to receive some money here for broadband here in the future, this would go a long way in ensuring that the dollars we receive will be going out for the installation of broadband. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. And I appreciate Representative Prokopiak keeping our law up with technology and bringing this bill before us. If there's no other discussion, let me ask, are there any negative votes on House Bill 1503? House Bill 1503 is reported from the Finance Committee unanimously. Next, I'd like to move to House Bill 1551, sponsored by Representative Siegel, and I'd like to call on our Senior Executive Director, Mark Foreman, for a description of House Bill 1551.
House Bill 1551 would modernize the Department of Revenue's Board of Appeals process for handling sales tax appeals by requiring the following information. If there are 250 or more transactions involved, shall include a detailed electronic spreadsheet, and an individual taxpayer would have 30 days to respond if there was a problem with the spreadsheet.
Thank you. So I move to bring up House Bill 1551. Is there any committee discussion on House Bill 1551? Chair Griner?
I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this yesterday. I will say, I think we've all received information. Unfortunately, the business community had not been at the table for any of these discussions, which I quite frankly don't understand. It's been an ongoing what I would call a problem with quite a few bills lately that involve the business community. And I will say, I think because of that, and there are, I mean, I think when you delve down the details, I think it's very problematic, and I would strongly encourage my colleagues to vote no on both this bill and the following.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. I do appreciate the discussion we had in the committee yesterday and Representative Siegel sharing with us, and also the Mr. Froman from the Department of Revenue. We have a question from Representative Webster. I'll get to that in a minute. I do want to say that the bill that in front of us now, 1551, would require not just turning over a box of receipts and having the Department of Revenue sort through, in terms of large volume cases where there are more than 250 transactions, but would require an electronic spreadsheet. And many of our businesses do keep electronic records, have electronic systems in their business. Also, I believe the Department of Revenue has shown a willingness to work with folks all across the state. We had an example just in the last couple of years where the Department of Revenue made some adjustments to allow telefiling for some taxpayers throughout the state who did not have computer access. The department allowed the telefiling of taxes to continue that system. So I believe the Department of Revenue is willing to work with folks, and I believe this bill includes language that would allow that. We have a question from Representative Webster. I'm sorry, Representative Waxman. Got to get a circular room so I can see who's raising their hand. Are there any other committee members who have discussion on House Bill 1551? I'd like to have a roll call vote on House Bill 1551.
Chairman Samuelson,
Yes.
Rep. Abney,
Yes by designation.
Sapita Freitas, Fleming,
Present and yes by designation.
Gallagher, Gungauer, Harris,
Yes by designation.
Inglis,
Yes by designation.
Krajewski,
Yes by designation.
Rab,
Yes by designation.
Scott,
Yes by designation.
Vincent,
Yes by designation.
Waxman, Webster,
Yes.
Chairman Griner,
No.
DeVanzo, Fritz, Gatos, Jones, Kephart, Kutz,
No by designation.
Mako,
No by designation.
Rossi,
No by, oh, she's here.
Rinkavich,
No by designation.
Stamba, Stender.
House Bill 1551 is reported from the Finance Committee by a vote of 14 to 12. Next, I'd like to call up House Bill 1552, sponsored by Representative Siegel. And I'd like to call on our Senior Committee Executive Director, Mark Foreman, for a description of House Bill 1552.
1552 modernizes the PA Department of Revenue Board of Appeals process for handling frivolous sales tax by including assessments if claims are materially incomplete or lack reasonable basis in fact or in law, provides for how those refunds would be subject to penalty. It provides a notice and response time frame. It has protective claim language. It offers ability to waive penalties based on unintentional error, immaterial error, or if good cause was demonstrated. Creates a minimum threshold claim of at least a $5,000 claim in order to apply to this section, and it assesses the penalty on either the taxpayer or the practitioner who handled the frivolous claim.
Thank you. Is there any committee discussion on House Bill 1552? Chair Griner.
Just following up for the same reasons, and I had mentioned both these bills, I am asking my colleagues for a no vote on this particular piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair Griner, and I appreciate the hearing, the discussion we had yesterday, and as we heard from Mr. Froman from the Department of Revenue, They get about 5,500 appeals involving sales tax refund a year, but because of some of the safeguards in this bill, we believe it would only affect about 500 of those, about 10%. And the bill outlines the process, and on page 3 of the bill, there's also all of those exceptions and that would allow for the Department of Revenue to consider other factors. There's a 60-day time period. If somebody has an appeal that falls under this legislation, they'd have 60 days to make corrections. If it's an incomplete appeal, they could make sure the documentation is complete. They could also prove that there's a good faith reason why the appeal needed that additional information. They could also make sure that if they're one of the ones that's under $5,000, the total value of the appeal would be less than $5,000. They would not even be covered. So I believe that there's some safeguards in the bill. They're outlined on page 3 of the bill that would cover many, many of the cases. But as we heard yesterday, there's some of the appeals take 137 days because the system is sometimes overwhelmed with appeals that are duplicative. Or we even heard yesterday there's cases where somebody's appealing for a refund of taxes that they never paid in the first place. And so this process, we believe, would allow the department to encourage good faith taxpayers all over the state to get their refunds quicker by addressing some of the backlog in the system. Any other comments from members of the committee? I'd like to have a roll call vote on House Bill 1552.
Chairman Samuelson,
Yes.
Rep. Abney,
Yes by designation.
Sapita Freites, Fleming,
Yes by designation and online.
Gallagher, Gungauer, Harris,
Yes by designation.
Inglis,
Yes by designation.
Krajewski,
Yes by designation.
Rabb,
Yes by designation.
Scott,
Yes by designation.
Vincent,
Yes by designation.
Waxman, Webster,
Yes.
Chairman Griner,
No.
DeVanzo, Fritz, Gatos, Jones, Kephart, Kutz,
No by designation.
Mako,
No by designation.
Rossi, Rinkavich,
No by designation.
Stamba,
No.
and Stender.
Thank you. House Bill 1552 is reported from the House Finance Committee by a vote of 14 to 12. Thank you for the voting meeting. Now we have a discussion of 2 bills which could come up for a vote next week, both involving historic preservation. The first bill is House Bill 1572, sponsored by Representative Gogenauer. And we have our prime sponsor, and also we have testimony from Mindy Crawford of the Preservation Pennsylvania, the Executive Director of Preservation Pennsylvania. I'd like to call on Representative Gogenauer for an introduction of his legislation.
Good afternoon, Chair Samuelson, Chair Griner, members of the Finance Committee. Today I want to introduce you to House Bill 1572, which will have an immense impact on the historic preservation tax with zero cost to the Commonwealth. In a little over a decade, we've increased the annual cap on the historic preservation tax credits from $3 million in 2012 to $5 million in 2019 to $20 million just last year in 2024. Clearly, the interest in preserving historic buildings continues to increase, but what has not increased is the cap on the amount of credits one project can receive. It remains at $500,000. My legislation increases the per project maximum credits to $1.5 million. I believe this accomplishes 2 important goals. It would make projects more feasible as the renovation costs for projects have grown exponentially, particularly when extra care must be taken to preserve historic spaces. We know only one of the most recent projects awards was less than $10 million, which is the second goal this increase would achieve. As we keep hearing that many projects never submit applications because the current cap limit provides little to no incentive considering the higher costs of historic preservation projects. Again, I want to reiterate my legislation spends no additional dollars but would likely have a major impact towards driving new interest in new historic preservation projects by increasing the per project cap from its current $500,000 to $1.5 million.
Thank you, Representative Gogenauer. Now I'd like to call on Mindy Crawford. Also, Representative Krajewski is present here at our committee meeting. I want to introduce Mindy Crawford by saying thank you. She has been an advocate for historic preservation in Pennsylvania for a long time. So we've had a tax credit in Pennsylvania since 2012, but I know Mindy and Preservation Pennsylvania were advocating for about 16 years before that to say we really need to do this. So many other states have had a tax credit, and Pennsylvania certainly has probably the most history of any state in the United States. So as Representative Gogenauer just said, we started the tax credit in 2012, we expanded it in 2019, and just last year, this committee voted yes on Representative Prokopiak's bill, which became law as part of our July 11th tax code. I'd like to call on Mindy Crawford for
Thank you. Chairman Samuelson, Chair Greiner, and members of the Finance Committee, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. I did provide my comments written. I will try not to read them, but I am very passionate about this. I've been working on this my entire career. And when we were literally my entire career. And when we were finally successful in 2012, thanks to Representative Freeman, who was the lead on that, we thought we had finally made it. Had we been the first, had we achieved this at the beginning, we would have been the third state in the United States to have a state tax credit. By the time we got it, we were then the 31st state to have a state tax credit. So we've always been a little bit behind the eight ball. But I want to very much thank the members of this committee and the General Assembly for making the decision to raise the cap from $5 million to $20 million in last year's budget. That will go into effect this year, October 1st, when it opens for applications. Since this program was conceived, it joined with the federal historic tax credit, which is incredibly successful. This is a companion to the federal piece. It has a very strong record here in Pennsylvania, even before we had a state tax credit. Since 1977, it's helped to rehabilitate over 3,000 buildings, leveraging more than $7 billion in private investment. In just the 20-year span between 2002 and 2022, the only records we have from the Park Service so far, those investments supported over 100,000 jobs and generated more than $4 billion in income and $1.6 billion in tax revenue. This often takes buildings that are off the local tax rolls and puts them back onto the tax rolls. The state tax credit program mirrors that success. In its first 5 years, the $15 million in credit supported $700 million in total project investment. That's a 47-to-1 return. And those investments are in existing places, infrastructure that's already exists in communities that need revitalization and in assets that tell Pennsylvania's story. But even with the increased cap, there are 3 critical limitations to the program at this time. I'm here to speak specifically to the project cap, but I'm going to mention 2 others. The per project cap at $500,000, in addition to that not being quite enough, DCED tends to divide that $500,000 in half and give only $250,000 in credits to each of the projects that apply that they select. It is selected with a random number generator at this point, which is not really the best way to pass out tax credits, but it's what we have in place now. This number does not really reflect the costs of today's construction costs, and it's usually for larger scale projects. That's who does the tax credits. Factories, abandoned schools, prisons, just about any kind of large white elephant building have really been able to be put back into service using the federal and the state tax credits. So the per project cap is still what it was limited to when it first started, unchanged since the program. And we also, it will make it more attractive, not just the additional $20 million, but the fact that a project could actually get $1.5 million in credits for their project. It makes a huge difference in putting together that funding stack. Second, we have a tiny technical issue. Many times, low-income housing and affordable housing projects have a member of their limited liability partnership that is a nonprofit, because that's the organization that will actually be running that low-income housing. And a few years ago, the Department of Revenue determined that nonprofits, if you were just a member of an LLP, you were not eligible to get the tax credits. So none of those projects were awarded any tax credits for several years. I believe under Secretary Brown, that has changed, but we would like to follow several other states by just getting that in the legislation saying that nonprofits are eligible to receive that as part of an LLC. And the other thing because most of those are the low-income housing, that's why it's so important to do that. And then the other thing that we addressed in 2019 when it was reauthorized was to, for the first time, assess a fee. And that fee is $100 per project. And it's split between DCED and the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, who do all of the reviews. That resulted in $600 to each agency to review this work, not really covering the costs of the staff to do all of the reviews for this work. So I would like to now or in the future revisit that and try to refigure out the fee structure based on the size of the project rather than just a flat $100 fee. The one thing that I think it's worth noting is that this is not a grant program. The state issues the tax credit only after the work is done, the money is spent, and the building is placed into service. So the state is not putting out money in hopes that a project goes forward. They're actually giving out the certificate at the end. It also, when the IFO did the evaluation of it in 2019, they determined that almost 37% of the credit's value was already returned to the state treasury before the tax credit was actually issued. They create, these kinds of projects create more jobs per dollar than almost any other industry in Pennsylvania, including gas and other energy. The state doesn't spend a dime until the work is done, reviewed, approved, and often people have moved into it. So we believe, the Coalition of Historic Tax Credit folks, that these improvements would make a big difference and make an already good project or program an even better program. And although this is not the time to be talking about an increase to that $20 million, as Chair Samuelson and I have talked about for a long time, we do think it is the time to take care of these minor issues in it so that it is a better program. And when the budget year is better, we can look at eventually raising it. Because at $20 million, we are not going to be able to meet the need. Once the new $20 million come into effect and the $1.5 million project cap is in effect, we're still going to be limited in the amount of projects that we can fund. So I thank you very much for the opportunity today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Let me start, and I know Preservation Alliance would like us to go higher than 20 million in future years. I think last year there was actually a Senate bill that would have taken it to 50
Correct.
million. And I think you've told me that our neighboring state of New York has no cap, so they're not limited by a certain budget number. It depends on which historic preservation projects come forward. I do have a couple of technical questions. One, last year we raised the amount to 20 million in our tax code on July 11th, but the year we're in right now, there's DCED is still using the 5 million. There was a 11-month time lag, and so the applications that are going to be out this November, that will use the 20 million. Mm-hmm. My hope is that if we make this change, if this actually can become law, that we wouldn't have to wait a whole 12 months. I think there's a sentence in the bill that would make that pretty clear already. This amendment shall apply to the fiscal year beginning on or after July 1st, 2025. So any tax code agreement we would come to in June or July or some other time, the language is clear that it should apply to the next fiscal year. Right. So when that $20 million becomes available with the applications in October, the new threshold would also be available. We're going to research that in the next week to make sure we don't need to add another sentence, but I'm reading that and I'm thinking that's pretty clear. Secondly, you mentioned affordable housing. A lot of the projects that might involve a nonprofit involve involve affordable housing. Of course, the nonprofit itself does not pay taxes, but they might be part of a coalition that has some tax liability. I'm going to ask about whether we need to increase the language about affordable housing in our existing program. My understanding is that the tax credit, if funds were available, would be 25% of the project cost. But if you include affordable housing, it would go up to 30%. So I'm going to wonder if we should raise that to 35 or 40% as an additional incentive for affordable housing projects. I'd be interested in your opinion on
Yes.
that.
When we did the reauthorization in 2020, we really felt that there should be an incentive for affordable housing. And that was how we ended up with, it had always been 25% in the original bill, but we added the workforce and affordable housing up to 30%. The federal credit is 20%. And so Pennsylvania would be even higher than the federal. But I do think, especially with the large amount of vacant buildings, especially with people going remote, with people giving up their offices, with schools consolidating, we have a huge number of buildings that would be wonderful for apartments. And we've seen so many successful projects. The other thing that is a sort of an added incentive is, it used to be that if you were taking historic tax credits and you also wanted to use low-income tax credits, they didn't work that well together. And so there have been changes made in both so that it's easier for you to use both the historic and the low income if you're rehabilitating a historic building. And so then by being able to do an incentive for workforce and affordable housing, I think would be a huge boon to the project. I also believe that once we get the word out that the $20 million is available this year, and if it includes the 1.5 cap, you're going to see more applications than we've seen ever, and probably for more money than we have.
Thank you. I remember we got statistics from DCED a year ago, from DCED last year, that said we had about 13 million or 14 million of requests at a time when they were only allowed to award 5 million.
Correct.
But with 20 million being available this coming fall, that number should grow.
Right. The other thing that was interesting about the applications this year is one project requested 29 million in credits. So obviously that sort of skews the numbers, but this was such a large project that 25% would have been 29 million. So we're going to see projects of all different sizes, but I do think that when we had our first year with only our 3 million, we had requests of almost 50 million. So as time went on and it stayed 3 million, 3 million, 3 million, and eventually 5 million, people stopped applying because they can apply in October. They're supposed to find out by February. Sometimes they don't find out because the governor likes to announce it when the governor likes to announce it, sometimes not until June. And so it wasn't worth waiting for the project to find out if they got $250,000 worth of credits. So I do think with the higher amount and the per project cap, we're going to see a lot more applications.
Let me ask Chair Greiner for some questions.
Yeah, just getting back to I'm going to be up front too. It's kind of funny. I'll sound more like somebody from the other side of the aisle. One of the things that I do get frustrated with is corporations that can afford these projects and they're looking for a credit when they have the money to go ahead and just making that comment. That does frustrate me a little bit when people do have the ability and the means and they're just looking for a kickback from the government. I don't know how we determine that, how we decide that, who the investors are. I'm just going to,
Sure.
That's what I heard last, so that's what I'll comment first. But let's look at the 5. Inherently, I don't have a problem with the bill, but I do wonder why. Isn't it better, though, to spread the wealth across the state with keeping the dollar? I'm kind of devil's advocate here. Why wouldn't we if we have that many people interested, why aren't we helping every area rather than, a few big ones? And then I'm going to segue. Can I get a list of who the awardees are? Who were these and I don't know whether you know, but how does DCED decide who the winners and the losers are in this?
Well, I'll answer that question first because it's the easy one. So when the project, everything that comes in on October 1st is considered first. So that means at midnight when it opens, everybody who's been working on an application puts in the single application. They're divided up into the 5 regions that DCED funds. And then, according to them, although I've never seen it myself, they do a random number generator in each of the 5 areas. And whoever gets to the top, usually the first 2, each get 250,000. If if one of the regions doesn't have any applications, then everybody else who didn't get selected goes into a random number generator, and that's how the rest of it is allocated. I've never been able to delve deep into that project, but that's what they're telling us.
So there, it is region, are the regions equal?
The regions,
When I say
depends
equal,
what you mean by that.
well, do they
because-
each get do they each get 1 million? If there's 5 regions, do they each get, in the old law, $1 million?
Yes. The challenge, though, is that on one region, Erie, for example,
Yeah.
there's usually 1 or 2 projects.
Right.
In Philadelphia, there's,
Or even Lancaster, I'm
37.
from Lancaster,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it's, everything's historic in our area.
It is, I understand spreading it across the state, but it really is unfair to the projects in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia because they're basically competing, and some of the other regions aren't really competing that highly. Northeast is usually pretty robust, but Northwest and the center, not so much.
So what's an example of a low-income housing historic, just to give me, that would be considered historic? That would be, because those guidelines are usually pretty tight to be determined historic, I thought.
Okay,
Maybe,
so-
maybe the term's loose, I don't know. I thought it was pretty tight, though, to determine what a historic property is.
So it has to be either listed on the National Register in a district, in a historic district,
Okay.
or it can be listed individually. So a lot of buildings, I'm going to use school buildings as example, buildings like here in Harrisburg, William Penn, that is one that is, ripe for housing, and it has been determined eligible for the National Register.
So it is on the national, like it's something like that would be, okay. I just was kind of, I was thinking of a warehouse, I'm thinking, I don't know how many warehouses would be on the National Register though, but you see that in Lancaster, you see right now we have a hospital, although that's not a national treasure, but we do have some things where I could see housing go in, and that school was a good example. I'm just trying to think in my mind, what that would
Right.
be.
Well, there have been quite a few in the Lancaster, like the Umbrella Factory was a
Right.
tax credit, and so it isn't that difficult to get an industrial building listed on the National Register because when we started out in historic preservation, we were accused of only saving the homes of dead white presidents. But that has expanded, and now we recognize industry, and we recognize engineering and bridges, and so it's a lot more. There's a lot more diversity in what gets listed. So the other thing that makes something easier to get listed is the fact that it wants to use tax credits, put the buildings back on the tax roll. They can.
Right.
So
Exactly.
It's a good incentive.
Yep, understood. No, appreciate the.
Sure.
Can I get a list of some of the projects were approved, or?
I can get you a list. I don't think that the latest has been announced.
No, we have a list from last year
Right.
that I think we shared with the committee at the time we were talking about last year's bill. The current year, they have not yet made the public announcement of which projects are going to get a piece of that $5 million.
Right.
But they tell us what, very soon?
So when does the 20 kick in?
So the applications open October 1st, and according to the legislation, they're supposed to be announced February 1st. Never happened. I've never seen it happen on February 1st. It's usually more like June.
But last year, I think we had a list in the springtime. This year, here it is June, and we have not yet had the announcement yet.
I've not seen it.
Okay.
But the spring of 2026, it'll be a larger amount. But obviously, if they have 30 applications like they've had, or 30 awards like they've had in the past years, the fact that some might qualify for more than 500,000. The 1.5 million in this bill is a maximum. Not everybody would get the 1.5 million, but it would allow the DCED to go over 500,000 with if a project is worthy of that level.
I mean, it wouldn't be, you'd have to, the 1.5 million is based on the total size of your project.
Right.
So, if you have a project that's a conversion of a small office building into offices,
Yeah.
it isn't going to need a $1.5 million credit.
But the list they gave us a year ago, all but one of the 30 projects were over $10 million. So they're mostly, all but one in the state would qualify for more than 500,000 if that funding was available. So we'll check if we can get last year's list and also find out when they're going to announce this year's list.
Can I just follow up? Like in his example, that's what goes back to my original question. My concern is we have 30 good projects, and all 30 right now are going to get something. I mean, just quick and dirty. They'll all get 250,000 or whatever. Now we run into a situation where now only 15 or 20 are going to get. I mean, ECD may decide to exclude the rest. That's the only thing. That's my little bit of my. I mean, I'm saying I'll probably be voting yes for the bill, but I do have that little. I do have just have that concern a little bit that maybe there's worthy projects who would have gotten it under the current bill that aren't going to get it now in the new one.
I will co-sponsor your bill to raise it to 45 million, because then we could, all 30 projects could get.
A couple things. I wanted to thank you for being here today, but I'm thanking you for not asking for an increase in this budget here. Thank you.
I did address that in my written comments, which you can read for yourself. But, you know, we hear from the developers, and they're telling us that to go through the long waiting period and to only end up with 250, their project has to already have all that funding in place. And if they're thinking that they might be getting 1.5 million, it makes it a little bit more worth wait to get in there. I understand what you're saying. And I also understand that's what DCED is saying. If we give one 500, but we could give two 250 each, but the developers don't see it that way. And then to go back to your other question about most tax credits are technically owned by an LLP that forms specifically for that rehabilitation project. That includes the developer. It sometimes includes a nonprofit if they're going to be the user of the building. And it often includes like a bank, because what the banks can use the credits, and they will sometimes give favorable terms so that they can be they can take the credits and get the terms. And I know you guys have to get into.
Well, I appreciate you being here. Feel free to stick around, because if there's more projects around the state, some of them might be eligible for the next bill, which is a proposal by Representative Bob Freeman, who's had this bill before our committee in the previous session. And this will be a new tax credit targeted. And I appreciate Bob's work on the original historic preservation tax credit in 2012. House Bill 1575 is a new proposal to have a specific tax credit for rehabilitation of mills and factories. Mm-hmm. And I will call on Representative Freeman for comments on House Bill 1575.
Thank you, Chairman Samuelson, Chairman Greiner, members of the committee. Appreciate the invitation to come before you today to give you an overview of my legislation. As Chairman Samuelson mentioned, this bill was introduced last session and reported from committee. We did make some refinements with the excellent help of Chairman Samuelson's staff to streamline it and I think make it a more effective bill. My legislation would establish a tax credit of 25% for the rehabilitation or reconstruction costs of a certified factory or mill complex to promote its redevelopment. All of us in our districts have an old mill or factory that's been sitting idle for many years. Once was a major employer, perhaps, but it's still a solid building, particularly if built in the time frame that we're talking about with my legislation. It can be brought back through adaptive reuse and become a very positive influence in the community, preserving the heritage of the community, but also providing economic opportunity developments through its reuse. Factories and mills can lend themselves very easily to retail, office, art space, dwellings, even manufacturing once again. And through my legislation, there would be an incentive to do so. There would be a $15 million tax credit maximum and up to a maximum of $1.5 million per project, like the historic bill you're considering, would be used. And there is some success stories already in terms of rehabilitating factories and mills. In my hometown of Easton, we rehabilitated the old 13th Street Silk Mill, a building that dates back to the 1890s, beautiful Victorian brick building, employed 1,000 people in its heyday, amazing space. And they pieced together funding from various sources to get that up and running and rehabilitated. And today it has numerous restaurants, retail space, and lots of apartments above. And it sits right on the Bushkill Creek, so it's a very idyllic setting, and has become a great success story. This legislation would help other projects like that and provide a real asset to their efforts to encourage the economic development, adaptive reuse, and in turn improve the quality of life in the community. So I would urge your support for it. I think it's timely, and I think It deals with some of the major projects that historic tax credits have tried to deal with, but it would take some of the pressure off of them by focusing on the kind of major project a factory rehab can oftentimes entail due to the challenges that sometimes exist in an industrial setting.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Freeman. I appreciate you bringing this bill before us again. As you said, this bill passed the committee last year, but did not pass the in the budget negotiation last summer. So we're trying again.
Yes,
I can think of many projects around the state. I think of the project that you referenced in Easton, a beautiful rehabilitation of an old mill. It has restaurants, it has businesses, it has residences,
numerous apartments,
and a dance studio. It's got a little bit of everything, and that property is now filled with. It's a vibrant property, a vibrant part of the community.
Yeah, it really it's brought a lot back to the community.
In Allentown, there's an old mill, an old factory that's now a business incubator. So there's many possibilities all over the state. And as you said, each one of us can think of some projects in our own district. Do we have any questions from members of the committee? Chair Greiner.
We were just looking at this here. This bill's changed significantly since last year, though, right?
We did streamline it. We originally had 3 different credits involved, and we got it down to one being 25% of the cost of rehabbing.
I just was kind of curious. I like the bill.
Oh.
Macro, but it's a tough budget year.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be upfront. I don't know how I'm going to vote on this yet. Conceptually, I think I actually really think it's a great, like you said, there's so much we can do.
Yeah.
I'm a believer that we need to try to preserve our historic. I mean, I'm very strong about that. Even in my own private life, I am engaged in preservation, historic preservation, and those type of things. So it's kind of funny. I support that, but I don't know with this budget year whether I can come around, and I'm being upfront with you today.
No, I understand.
I don't know whether I can land yes when we.
And I
when we
appreciate
vote
your
on
kind
this.
comments and the concepts. And I'd love to get your support because I think it's critical.
I do think, but I do think overall, I really like the idea. I'm just letting you know.
Thank
So
you.
if you get a no vote, it's not because I don't like the bill
Well,
from a macro.
I understand.
It's a tough. I worry. I'm worried sick about this budget.
Yeah,
you know?
maybe we can get your yes vote. In terms, too, of thinking that this is something that can generate economic development.
Well,
and
that's what I was going to
opportunity.
say. It gets back to the other one. I mean, I do
Yeah.
think there can be a win. You know, I was wondering whether anybody has calculations on is it going to work the same way where you don't get paid until the end? It's not a grant
That's correct.
program.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that makes for an investment in our communities and in our economy. It also helps the local tax base. These have been idle for a long time. They don't assess at a high value. You get them up and running as a smart new building. And
Well, I get back to
yeah.
what I said. I'd rather see buildings rehabbed rather than torn down, and maybe
Exactly.
And then you start building new. It's like you have some amazing properties, and if we can restore them, I personally like to see that. That's just me.
And in many respects, the construction of that period, late 19th century, early
They're
20th
often
century,
better. They're
much more solid.
The bones
Yeah.
they're better well built.
And they were built with aesthetics, so they lend themselves very easily to adaptive reuse because it becomes a handsome
I just
dwellings or.
I just want to let you
apartments.
know if you know where.
Well,
why
keep
if I
thinking
go
good thoughts.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Any other questions for a member of the committee? I'm feeling positive about both bills, and
Good, thank you.
and we have made some changes to the mill and factory bill since last year. As
We did.
Representative
We
Freeman
s- we
said, it
streamlined
was
it.
3 separate credits. Now it's 1 credit that's kind of paralleled after the historic preservation.
Mm-hmm.
A maximum of 25% of the project cost, like we have in the historic preservation program. And also the cap that we're talking about in the Goggenauer legislation, 1.5 million, is in the Freeman proposal. So it'll be 2 parallel proposals. We do have a lot of history in Pennsylvania, a lot of worthy projects. I realize in this budget year, making an amendment to the existing 20 million, as Representative Goggenauer seeks to do, it might be a little more difficult to get $15 million for a new program, but you can certainly justify the need for it.
Oh,
And as
absolutely.
we just heard in our previous discussion, there's way more than $20 million of projects out there that would qualify for historic preservation. If some of them could apply under a new program specific to mills and factories, I think we'd have more opportunities to preserve our wonderful history here in Pennsylvania.
I agree. And keep in mind, again, it would generate economic development. You would get, you're investing in the ability to increase tax revenues in a sense, because you're now giving value to those buildings.
Thank you. Members for
Thank you.
discussion. It's my intention to bring these two bills up for a committee vote next week. We're in session Monday and Tuesday, and I'll be bringing both bills up at a meeting one of those 2 days. This meeting is adjourned.